Hey you guys, it's Anita, and in today's video I have a sew along for you. We're going to be sewing McCall's 8035, and I'm going to be sewing view C, which is the longer version. Now if you missed the pattern review that I posted for this pattern, go back and watch that first because I give you all of the information about the pattern. I show you the other two views included with the pattern, so if you don't like maxi dresses, then you can sew one of the shorter versions. So today I'm going to walk you through the process of sewing the dress from beginning to end. Now, this sew along assumes you already have basic sewing skills. If you are brand new to sewing and you have not learned yet, then I highly recommend that you get enrolled in my new online sewing course, Learn to Sew, Mastering the Basics. In that course, I walk you through the entire process of learning how to sew your own garments step by step with lots of details. So if you've enjoyed my videos here on YouTube, then you're gonna love the sewing course. So go check out that course. There's a link in the description box below this video so that you can check out the course page to see everything that's included, and then you can go ahead and enroll. Then after you learn the basics, come back here and join the sew along. For those of you who have already gone through my course, for those of you who already know how to sew, this is a beginner-friendly pattern, so you should be able to follow along with no problem and sew this beautiful dress. Before you get started, I encourage you to go and grab a copy of my sewing project checklist. This is a checklist that I have created to help you gather all of the items that you will need for any sewing project before you get started, so that you have everything in place before you start. And that helps to streamline the process. It helps to cut down on all of the extra time that you spend running around trying to find the things that you need while you're sewing. If you missed the video where I shared lots of tips on how you can streamline your process, then go and check that out. Grab your checklist and let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do for our prep work is interface our front and back facings. Now I'm using a very lightweight interfacing because my fabric, the gauze, is very lightweight, and you'll notice I've interfaced all the way to the edges of the fabric. Usually I will leave open the seam allowance, so I will cut away around the perimeter of the facing, the interfacing, so that I don't get bulkiness in the seam allowance. And that's usually when I'm using a medium or heavyweight interfacing, but because this is so lightweight, I'm not worried about bulkiness in the seams. So I've interfaced all the way up to the edges on the front facings. And then, just as an example to show you, if you were using a medium or heavyweight interfacing, you would leave open the seam allowance. So you would cut away enough of the interfacing so that you have that seam allowance open, so that when you sew your seam, the interfacing is not included in that seam allowance, leaving the bulkiness. And I've just kind of freehanded this, so it's not 5/8 of an inch all the way around. I just wanted to give you an example of what it would look like. So we're gonna pin our back facing to the front facings. So take your front facing on the flat or the straight end, and your inner or your back facing, and you're going to match the notches and pin. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. Match your notches and pin. Then we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch from the outer edge to the inner edge. So let's go to the machine. Okay, you're going to do the same thing on the other side, and then you're going to take your facing to your pressing station, and you're going to press your seam allowances open. Okay, and then after we've pressed our seam allowances flat, we're going to go and, or you will go and finish off your raw edge on the outer edge of the facing. Now I'm going to be using my serger to finish off the raw edge. If you don't have a serger, you can simply fold over and press. it's going to be, or you won't see this side because this will be on the inside of your garment, and you'll see a nice neat finish on the end with the fold. Now we're going to prepare the bodice for the dress. I have the bodice back and then the two bodice fronts. So I'm going to take my bodice back and open it out with the right sides facing up. And then I'm going to take one of my bodice fronts and I'm going to pin it at the shoulder seam. And you want to make sure you're using the correct, you're placing the front on the correct side so you see the angle going down. And then you want to match your notches and pin. Okay, so we have the shoulders pinned, and we're also going to pin the sides. Matching your notches, you have double notches on the side. And now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're just going to stitch from the outer edge of the shoulder toward the neckline on both sides. And then on the bodice, we're going to stitch from the bottom edge on the side and stitch up to the arm side. Okay, so you will finish all of your seam allowances with your preferred method and then go to the pressing station and press your seams toward the back of the bodice. So finish off both your shoulder seams and the side seams. Okay, now that we have our side seams and the shoulders sewn together, we're gonna attach our facing. So let's take the bodice and with the right side facing up, we're going to take our facing with the right side facing down, and the raw edges will meet. So first we're going to pin at the shoulder seam. So match the shoulder seam on your bodice to the shoulder seam on the facing. And then we're going to pin at both shoulder seams. And then we'll go in between the two shoulders and pin. And then we're going to continue pinning the facing onto the bodice along the front edge. So first I'm going to match the marking on the bodice with the, or on the facing with the marking on the bodice. Make sure that's aligned. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin down the length of the facing. Make sure that you're matching your notches. Okay, and then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch from one end of the bodice or the facing all the way around to the other end. Okay, we're beginning and ending with the back stitch. Okay, now that we have our facing sewed onto the bodice front, we're going to trim away the seam allowance. And I'm going to trim away about ½ inch, or not ½ inch. I'm going to trim away about half of the seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to go in and clip around the curve of the neckline. And the reason we do that is we want to make sure that it folds over nice and smoothly. So I'm going to cut in notches around the curve. Make sure that you're using very sharp scissors when you do this. Scissors that are sharp to the tip. And just right around the curve. And you can clip in however many you feel are necessary. I'm just going to do a few on each side. Make sure that you don't clip in to your thread on the seam. And just in case you're wondering what fabric shears I'm using right now, these are from LDH, and oh my gosh, they are amazing. Okay, so there we have it. We're going to go to the pressing station first, and we're going to press over our seam allowance, and we're going to press the seam allowance toward the facing. Okay, now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch right along that seam onto the facing. And that prevents the facing from rolling over to the right side when you're wearing your garment. Okay, so sewing from the right side onto the facing, I'm aligning this plastic edge of my presser foot along that seam. And we're just going to sew from one end to the other, and there's no need to backstitch. Okay, so we're going to take the facing and turn it in toward the garment. And it should fold over nice and neatly. And when you turn it over, you won't see the facing peeking out. Okay, and then we're just going to press that. Okay, we have attached the facing to the bodice, and that looks really good. The next step is we're going to cross over the bodice fronts and attach them at the bottom. So you're going to place down the left front and then cross over the right front. I'm going to turn this upside down. And then we have notches on the bottom. We have 2 single notches on the bodice left and the bodice right. So we're going to match those notches and pin. Then we're going to go over to the end, making sure that the facing is flat. And then we're going to pin on both ends, making sure your facing is flat. Then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to insert a basting stitch from one end all the way over to the other. And you're going to sew right to the end. Okay, we're going to take our sleeves and we're going to create the basting stitch in between the 2 dots on the sleeve cap for easing. So 2 rows of basting stitches from one dot to the other dot. Let's go to the machine. Okay, so before we insert our basting for the ease stitch, make sure that you leave a long tail when you start so that you will have enough to pull up the basting stitches, and make sure that your machine is set to the longest stitch on your machine and no back stitch. So let's sew from one dot to the other. Okay, I'm gonna raise my needle and presser foot. I'm gonna pull off so that I can get a long tail. And then we're gonna go and sew another seam within the seam allowance. So I'm just gonna align the edge of the fabric with my presser foot. Now that we've inserted our 2 rows of basting stitches, we're going to pin this sleeve together. So you're going to take your sleeve, and with the right sides facing, you're going to fold over and pin your seam starting at the notch. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom and make sure that's even at the bottom. And I'll insert one more pin here. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a regular stitch from the bottom all the way up to the top. Okay, so I've pressed the seam allowance flat on both sides. Now I'm gonna open that out, open the sleeve out, and we're gonna press the seam allowance toward the back of the sleeve, and that will be the side that has the double notch. So I'm gonna use my seam roll again and pressing only on that seam allowance with the tip of the iron. Okay, so this is what your sleeve should look like after you're done sewing in your seam, finishing off your edges, pressing up your fold on the end or at the hem. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the sewing machine and edge stitch along the fold to close the hem. And we're going to leave an opening about an inch so that we can insert the elastic. Whenever I'm sewing a piece in the round, I like to access the free arm on my Baby Lock Soprano. I simply remove the sewing table, access the free arm, and then place my piece around the free arm to sew. And this is especially helpful when you're sewing small openings, like for a sleeve that's closer fitted to your arm to your wrist so you can sew and turn your fabric around the free arm. So we're going to start just past the seam there, and we're just going to top or stitch close to that fold. So I'm going to move my needle over to the left so that I can get as close to that fold as necessary. And I'm using this clear end on my presser foot as my guide. So I'm going to keep that guide right along the fold, and my needle is over to the left. And we're going to start and end with a back stitch. Okay, and I'm going to stop there, back stitch. And now we have an opening to insert the elastic. We're going to attach our sleeves. So I'm going to take my bodice and turn it wrong side out. Okay, and then I'm going to grab a sleeve. And the important part is to make sure that you're using the correct sleeve. So I have a single notch on the front bodice and a double notch on the back bodice. So we're going to grab a sleeve and we're going to turn the sleeve right side out. And then we want to make sure that we're working with the correct sleeve for this side of the bodice or for this armhole. So I need my single notch on this side. And on my sleeve, this has a double notch. So this is not the right sleeve. So we're going to grab the other one. And it has the right side out, single notch, double notch, matching the bodice. So I'm going to take the sleeve and insert it into the armhole opening. And then we're going to match the underarm seam on the bodice and the sleeve. Then we're going to match the notches. Then we're going to go to the top of the sleeve cap, and we're going to match the marking in the center with the shoulder seam on the bodice. And then we'll match the other markings on the sleeve with the marking on the bodice. Now we're going to use our basting stitches to ease in the fullness on the sleeve. Okay, so I'm going to take the two threads on the wrong side of the sleeve, and I'm just going to pull, and you will see that it creates a gathering. And I'm going to distribute the gathers with my thumb so that they fit and ease into the armhole opening. Okay, so just pull your thread, and as it gathers, you can just use your finger or your thumb to distribute the gathers. Okay, and once you have it fitting the armhole opening, then you will pin. And I tend to use more pins when I'm easing in a sleeve. Okay, and you're going to do the same thing on this side. And after you have eased your sleeve into the armhole for both sides or both sleeves, then you're going to go to the sewing machine and you're going to sew a stitch all the way around. Okay, we're beginning and ending with a back stitch. Make sure that your seam allowance is flat on the bottom before you close it off. And backstitch. And then I'm going to pull the sleeve through the armhole opening. And I'm using my tailor's ham. I'm going to slip that inside. And then we're going to press the seam toward the sleeve. We're going to do that all the way around, and then we will be done inserting the sleeve. Okay, now we're going to sew the skirt portion of the dress. So I have the skirt front and back, and because both pieces look identical, I have marked a B on the skirt back at the waist so that I will know which piece I'm working with. So you can do that or use whichever method you'd like to mark one of the pieces so that you will know which is which. Now, I'm going to take my back and open it out with the right side facing up. And then I'm going to take the front and I'm going to place it down onto the back with the right sides facing each other. And then I'm going to pin from the bottom to the top, or top to the bottom, it doesn't matter. You just want to pin your edges together on both sides. Making sure that the raw edges are even. Okay, so we're going to pin both sides of the side seam for the skirt, and then we're going to pin, or we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from the bottom at the hem all the way up to the top at the waist. And the reason I like to start at the bottom is because I want to make sure that I have a nice even edge on the hem so that when I get ready to hem the dress, I don't have anything uneven going on. Just in case the fabric shifts when you're sewing, and then when you get to the top, if you find that you have an uneven edge here, if that happens at the bottom, then I don't like that. I just want to make sure I have an even hem on the bottom, or even edge on the bottom. And I want the same thing at the top, but if it does shift and I get a little bit of unevenness at the top, I'm not too worried about it. Okay, so when we go to the machine, we're going to sew from the bottom up to that mark that you placed on your fabric for your hem. And I'm going to place 2 pins here just to mark that. We're going to use a basting stitch. So that's going to be the longest stitch on your machine from the bottom up to that mark. And then we're going to continue from that mark all the way up to the waist edge of the skirt using a regular stitch. So we're going to start here, back stitch, and sew all the way up to the top. So go ahead and pin the other side of your skirt, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew. So I'm starting with the basting stitch, no back stitch. Okay, so I'm coming up on the mark for the slit. Okay, now I'm going to change to a 2.5 millimeter stitch. And I'm going to begin and end with a back stitch. Okay, now to finish the seam allowances on the slide where we are creating the slit in the dress, you're going to find that mark where the basting stitch ends and the regular stitch starts. So mine is right here. And what you're going to do, this is the way I do it. Now you can follow along with the pattern instructions if you like, but this is how I treat mine. So I'm going to snip right where that marking is through the seam allowance, right up to, but not through that thread, the stitching, okay? And then I'm going to go to my serger, or you can use whichever finishing method you choose. And for the portion of the skirt above the snip up to the waist, I'm going to use my serger to finish that off. So I'm just using the tip of the iron just to press onto that seam allowance. And you'll see I'm not pressing my bubbles flat. Okay, so we're going to continue that all the way up to where that snip is in the fabric. Okay, so I've pressed the seam allowance open up to that snip. Next, we're going to just create a fold right or on both sides, and we're going to fold the raw edge in to that seam. Okay, so we're going to just fold that in. We don't want to flatten out the bubbles. Okay, and then you're just going to do that on both sides from the bottom all the way up to this snip. Okay, now that we have this seam and the fold pressed in for the slit, we're going to go to the pressing state or to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch. We're going to top stitch from the right side, but I'm not going to open this seam yet. I'm going to leave it closed because I like having all of this area. Okay, so I've changed over to my all-purpose foot because it has a narrower edge here, and I'm going to use this seam as my guide. So I'm going to run the left edge of the seam or the presser foot along that seam, and I've adjusted my needle over to the left. And it's not necessary to do a back stitch. I just had it preset. And I placed the pin where I want to pivot, so I'm going to sew up to the pin. I'm going to leave my needle in the fabric, lift my presser foot and pivot. Okay, I'm going to sew over to the other side. Lift my presser foot and pivot again, and I'm aligning the presser foot right along that seam, and I'm going to continue down to the bottom of the skirt. Okay, so I've finished off the seam allowance on the skirt above that snip, and I'm going to press the seam toward the back of the skirt. Now our seam allowances on the skirt are done. On the other side, if you're not sewing in a slit, you can just finish off your seam allowance, press it toward the back of the skirt, or press your seam allowances open, whichever you choose. And then we're ready to go to the next step. Now that we have sewn in our slit, we're going to use our seam ripper to open that up. I'm going to turn this around so that you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm just going to insert my seam ripper, and I'm just holding both sides with one hand, And I'm going to use that seam ripper to push through. Make sure that you're using a sharp seam ripper. If you have to tug, that means your seam ripper isn't sharp enough and you could risk tearing through your fabric. So you should be able to just easily glide through and it will just open it up for you. And I'm going to give you a closer view. So your seam ripper should glide through easily without any effort. And you want to take your time. You don't need to rush through. Just take your time and push it. So just by barely touching the thread, your seam ripper should cut through. And what I'm doing now is I'm using my right hand to rest it on this side, and I'm using the left hand to pull it open so that I can see the thread. And then I'm just pushing my seam ripper through and allowing it to do the work without forcing it. If your seam ripper is sharp enough, it will do the work for you and you will not risk tearing or cutting through your fabric. Okay, and then you will continue that all the way up to the stopping point. And when you get to the stopping point, be careful that you don't cut through that cross stitch of thread. Okay, and then you will go back and pull out all of the loose threads, and then your slit is done. Now we're going to attach the bodice to the skirt. So I have my skirt here with the wrong side facing out, and I have the front of the skirt with the 2 notches facing up. So what I'm going to do is take the bodice, I'm going to turn it upside down, and I'm going to insert it into the skirt with the front of the bodice facing up and the right side out. Okay, so we have the skirt and the bodice with the right sides facing. I'm going to open this bodice out flat. And here I'm holding on to the front of the bodice. Here is the back. I'm holding the front, and then I'm going to take the front of the skirt and I'm going to match the notches on the bodice to the notches on the skirt and pin. Then I'm going to match the side seam on the skirt with the side seam on the bodice. On both sides. And then I'm going to turn it over to the back. I'm going to open that out, and then I'm just going to pin across the back. If you want, you can find the center front and the center back before you pin, but it's not really necessary. And then I'm going to go back around to the front and continue pinning wherever you feel necessary. And I'm making sure that I pin right where the ends of the wrap are on the bodice front. Okay, so after you are done pinning your skirt to the bodice, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to insert a regular stitch all the way around. Okay, now that the bodice is attached to the skirt, we're going to trim away the seam allowance. And as you can see, I've already started, but we're only trimming away the seam allowance on the bodice. We're leaving the seam allowance from the skirt intact. So what I'm doing is I'm folding back the seam allowance on the skirt, folding it out of the way so that I can cut the seam allowance on the bodice only. And you will continue that all the way around until you've cut away all of the seam allowance on the bodice. Then if you desire, you can finish off this seam allowance from the skirt, and then you will go to your pressing station and you will press the seam allowance from the skirt up toward the bodice. And that's what we're going to use to create the casing for the elastic. Okay, after you have trimmed away the seam allowance on the bodice and finished off the seam allowance on the skirt and pressed it up, this is what it should look like. So now what you're going to do is go to your sewing machine and you're going to stitch along the edge of the skirt seam allowance, creating a casing that you're going to use to insert your elastic. So you will start at one point and then sew all the way around and leave about a 1-inch opening so that you can insert your elastic. Okay, to sew in my hem, I am using the 1-inch mark on my sewing machine, my needle plate, and I have moved my needle over to the far right for 6 millimeters because I want to make sure that I'm catching the edge of the fabric or the hem. And I'm beginning and ending with the back stitch. Okay, we're coming up on the end and we're going to make sure that we back stitch. Okay, our hem is sewn in and we can take that to the pressing station and give it a nice press. And we're done. If you would like to see the various ways that I styled the dress, including tying a knot on the bottom where the slit is, so cute, then head over to my blog, Anita by Design. There is a link in the description below that will take you over, and then you can see pictures of all of the different options for styling the dress. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.